We have a very special guest on this edition of Getting to Work, the podcast of NCI Works. I'm John Spencer from Starved Rock Media. Today's guest, and normally I don't do a lot of this build up because, frankly, I think it's a lot of filler and designed to make our guest feel good. I don't think we need to make Chris feel good, first of all. And I think he deserves the accolades. A member of the Speakers Hall of Fame, New York Times best-selling author, coach, mentor, books on success, leadership, sales, and motivation. One of the top speakers in the world. Chris, you've traveled to Australia, China, Russia, of course, all over the continental U.S., companies like Microsoft, GE, Harvard Business School. How did we get you on NCI Works, Getting to Work?
Well, I am very fortunate to be here, and that promo was exactly like I sent it to you. So thanks so much.
It was perfect. It was. I can read somewhat. Chris Widener, great to have you here. We're going to talk about personal responsibility and accountability. We've done a couple of podcasts in the last few months on quiet quitting and work ethic, and everybody says it's not what it once was, and it always starts with yourself, I think. And particularly before you can move on to helping others, which is kind of where we go with this podcast often. Before we get to either of those things, I want to find out a little bit more about you and how you got here in life. I know you were in radio once because you got fired in radio. You haven't been in radio until you've been fired. So welcome to the club, Chris.
Yeah, I think even the biggest and the best have been fired at one point. Doesn't matter where you are along the political aisle. I think Howard Stern's been fired. I think Rush Limbaugh had been fired. I think, most of the big people been fired, but they went on to fame and fortune in radio and I didn't. But I had a crazy upbringing. That's how I got into public speaking. My dad was the fifth partner at an architecture firm called NBBJ, which did the Google campus. They're one of the largest architecture firms in the world. He passed away in 1970 when I was 4. 1969, he'd made $90,000, which back then was like gangster money. Most Americans would still say, sign me up for the $90,000 a year plan. But in 1969, it was a lot of money. He was severely underinsured. He had $30,000 worth of life insurance. My mom had to sell the house, which recently sold for $3.2 million. She had to sell it because she couldn't afford the $400 a month mortgage payment. So it began a downward spiral, 28 homes, 11 different schools, shipped off to live with relatives twice, made my money betting the horses at Long Acres Horse Track south of Seattle. Growing up, I started drugs in the 6th grade, drugs and alcohol in the 6th grade. Probably the only thing that really, really saved me from going over the edge was that I got my first job when I was 11 years old, and I spent 7 years as a ball boy for the Seattle Supersonics. So my first year, we lost the world championship, 1977-78, to the Washington Bullets. And the second year, 1978-79, we won the world championship. So the greatest moment of my life happened when I was 13 years old, when I was in a ticker tape parade through downtown Seattle with 500,000 people and standing on the stage with the NBA World Championship Seattle Supersonics. So where do you go from there? It all peaked at 13. I peaked at 13.
Amazing. And for a number of people that would be, you have overcome so much, what you went through with losing your father and then all of the different homes and families and being shipped around. Any number of those obstacles would have, just ended it for many, many people. Yet you were able to push through, find a way. How do you make money betting the horses, Chris?
Well, first of all, it's actually, if you really want to get into horse racing theory, it's actually pretty easy. When you are at a horse track that is, hundreds of miles away from other horse tracks, there's not a lot of new horses. It's the same horses every time. Yeah. So back when I was, the best horses when I was there was Trooper 7 was one of the horses, and Pappy was another horse, and of course the Baez brothers, Baez, they were jockeys there. So it was kind of like betting on the same thing over and over and over again. Whereas you go down into California where there's, all these tracks and they move from track to track and it's a bigger mixture of horses. So in long story short, it was actually relatively easy. And of course, I was only betting anywhere from $2 to $10 a bet. I was a 6th grader, but, I was hitting daily doubles for a few $100 and doing pretty well. My uncle was a horse owner. His son now owns horses, and his brother, my other cousin, is actually one of the top horse trainers in America today. So they went on into the horse business, and I went into the speaking business, but that's how I did it. We made pretty decent money for 12 and 13 years old.
That's amazing. And leads us to this place of, you did the work, you did the study, you saw an opportunity, you did the work, and you made it happen. You could have at any point in time been the victim. Lord knows people claim the victim, with far fewer obstacles to overcome than you did, Chris, but you didn't. You kept pushing on.
Yeah, my mother, I always say my mother was the best and worst thing that happened to me. She had borderline personality disorder, so it made for a tumultuous upbringing. Like I said, she shipped me off to live with relatives twice, once in the 4th grade, once in the 9th grade. In the 4th grade, she shipped me off to live with my Aunt Rochelle and my Uncle Paul, who were a log truck driver and a school bus driver. And she moved to Okinawa with a Marine that she'd met. So I spent 18 months having the tar beat out of me by my Uncle Paul, the log truck driver, so badly that when he finally was on his deathbed, I hadn't seen him in 30 years. He called me up and asked me to come down, where he asked me for forgiveness. So it was a pretty bad deal. But the one thing my mother said to me over and over and over again was, if anybody else can do it, you can do it. She was the worst thing because she beat me to half to death all the time, but she was the best thing because she instilled in my mind that I could do whatever I wanted to do. And I specifically remember one time in a bookstore, she waved her hand at the bookstore and she said, look at all these books. If these people could write a book, you could write a book. And I've now written 24 books. And, she used to pull me out of school and we would go on these trips and I would say, shouldn't I be in school? And she would say, Mark Twain said, don't let school get in the way of your education. And so she would pull me out of school and we would go on these trips. And so I missed a lot of school, but she wanted me to get a different kind of education. So, there was some hardship with her, but there was also a lot of blessing with her as well.
Best of times, worst of times. So we got a little bit more insight into Chris Widener and how you got where you are today. Now, give us a little bit more, if you would, on how we can maybe be a little more accountable for what we do on a daily basis. We all fall victim from time to time of circumstances, and boy, our luck is just horrible, isn't it?
Yep. Well, I'll tell you, first of all, there is no such thing as accountability. Nobody can hold you accountable. I do not believe in accountability. People, I have an accountability partner. No, you don't. They literally can't they can't hold you accountable. They can harp on you, but the only person who decides whether you're going to be accountable to what you said is you. You're the only one who decides whether or not you do what you say you're going to do. You say, I'm going to lose weight. And then you go out and you're with your friends. You tell all your friends, I'm going to lose weight. You go out to the restaurant, you order, a giant burger and onion rings and, ice cream for dessert. And they go, what are you doing? I thought you said you were going to. All the harping in the world, you are the only person who makes a decision about whether you're going to lose weight. And so I always say the only accountability is personal accountability. So lots of people have dreams and wishes of what they hope life will be, but it's the people who are able to hold themselves accountable that are actually going to achieve those things, who say to themselves, I am going to do what it takes. I had the great fortune in the early 2000s of being mentored and working with three of the greatest legends of the speaking industry. A guy named John Maxwell, who sold, I think, 35 million copies of books I wrote for him. And then I moved on to a guy named Jim Rohn, R-O-H-N. Many of your listeners will know Jim Rohn. He gave Tony Robbins his first job, and I spent the last 7 years of his life working with him, wrote his last book. And then a guy named Zig Ziglar. Most people know the name Zig Ziglar. See you at the top, probably the greatest original motivational speaker. And by the way, I always love to say this. I don't know if you've ever read his autobiography, but do you know what Zig Ziglar's real first name was?
No, what?
Hillary. And in his autobiography, he says, now you know why they call me Zig. But so anyway, Jim Rohn always used to say, everyone must experience one of two pains, the pain of discipline or the pain of regret. Discipline, the pain of discipline weighs ounces. The pain of regret weighs pounds. And I love that quote. It's one of his most famous quotes. You have to choose one of two pains, the pain of discipline or the pain of regret. Let's face it, it's no fun to not eat ice cream and sit on the couch and watch a movie. I mean, it is fun to do that. It's no fun to not do that and go hit the treadmill, right? So
Yes.
that's the pain of discipline. It requires some pain. Yeah, you'd rather be at the beach, but you got to go make sales calls. So there's a little bit of pain, but if you'll experience the pain of discipline, you won't experience the pain of regret. But if you go to the beach and you buy fancy bags instead of spending and instead of saving and investing your money, if you eat ice cream and watch Netflix all night rather than hitting the treadmill, if you won't experience that pain of discipline, you will experience the pain of regret. You'll be overweight, you won't have the money you want to have to retire, whatever the case may be. So I think it's really important for us to understand we all have the same opportunities, but some people will discipline themselves and hold themselves accountable so that they can get to their dreams. And other people, for one reason or another, are either unable or unwilling to do so.
That's amazing. You have a tip or two on how we can find this motivation for ourselves that some of us at times find a little lacking and a little hard to do? Freely admit there's a reason the camera stops about right here.
Well, I'm glad you used the word motivation, and I'll tell you why. One of the things my mother did for me that has served me well in my writing and speaking career is my mother taught me to love words. Particularly, she taught me to love root words. My mother could do the Sunday morning New York Times crossword puzzle in 11 minutes in pen. And I know she can because I saw her do it once. And I remember asking her, she was on my back porch out in Seattle, and the 11 minutes is what it took me to go make her a pot of coffee. I handed her the Seattle Times, went in to grab the coffee, brought it back out. 11 minutes later, folded up next to her was the completed Sunday morning New York Times crossword puzzle. And she said, well, I said, how do you do that? She said, well, number one, I studied Latin in high school. They don't teach it anymore. And number two, I like root words. And a lot of times you can figure out what it is. And number three, I've done it for 50 years. So, I love the root word of motivation, because most people, when somebody says, hey, are you feeling motivated? We always attach motivation to feeling. But if you go to the root word and you break it down, the root word is motive. And when you go to the dictionary, motive is a compelling reason to act. And so motivation is not whether you feel it or not. It's whether you have a compelling reason to act. And one of the illustrations I love, I think I read it in Reader's Digest or Guideposts. It was one of those little books, one of those little feel-good monthlies, and it was about a guy. He was 150 pounds overweight. They found out that his daughter needed a kidney. So they go to the doctor. Doctor says, well, we're going to test the family first. The family's always the most likely to be a match. So basically, they came back and they said, we got some good news, we got some bad news. And he said, okay. Dad says, what's the good news? Good news is you're a perfect match. Okay, what's the bad news? You're too fat. We can't do surgery on you. And Dad says, how much weight do I need to lose and how much time do I have to lose it? And they said, if you could lose 75 to 100 pounds in 9 months, that would be great.
Wow.
Well, Dad had been fat his entire life. Dad knows how to lose weight. We all know how to lose weight. Stop eating so much and get out and do some exercise, obviously under the care of a doctor or something like that. But he'd never had the motive. He'd never had the compelling reason to act. Well, your daughter's death is a compelling reason to act, or her impending death is a compelling reason to act. So guess what Dad did? He lost 75 pounds in 9 months. Because he finally had the motivation. And I guarantee you, when he got up on a lot of those days, he didn't feel like hitting the treadmill, but he had a compelling reason to act. So I think the biggest thing is to stop looking at how do I feel every day and start saying, what do I need to do today? What's my reason? What's my driving factor? Which is why, guys like Simon Sinek and those folks who, Simon wrote the book, I think it was called Begin With Why. You have to have your why. What is that compelling reason? And for some, it's money. For some, it's impact. For some, it's relationships, whatever it might be. Totally fine. It's totally up to you. But you have to find that thing that's going to be strong enough that's going to drive you toward your goal instead of just, the greatest athletes in the world don't feel like doing it sometimes. And, but they do it. They show up anyway. The greatest business people, they show up every single day. I grew up in the Seattle area and was there until I was 50 years old. And I can remember driving, I lived in the town next to Microsoft, and I can remember driving by Microsoft at 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning. And, you drive by their campus and all the windows were lit up and you could see people walking around. There's a reason those people are worth tens of millions. There's a reason janitors are worth $10 million and admins are worth $40 million and executives are worth $500 million, because they were in that place till 2 a.m. on a Saturday night working. It's what drove them.
But a lot of times it's not money either. And
Right.
particularly for people who may feel somewhat trapped in where they are. I mean, from what you've said, we can go anywhere, we can do anything. But I think a lot of people do feel somewhat trapped and held back, don't they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And a lot of it is that I think the first thing you have to do is you have to realize, what are the choices that I made that got me here? So the first thing you have to do is you have to accept personal responsibility. Wherever you are right now is because of you and your choices. Now, somebody says, "Oh, you don't know my parents." Oh, yeah, I do. I had one. I know your parents.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't know this, you don't know that. Well, everybody experiences bad stuff. The richest people in the world, they lose babies, they get divorced, they die young. There's everybody experiences pain. Jesus said, "In this world, you'll have trouble." I'm telling you, there never has a truer statement been mentioned. In this world, you'll have trouble. Don't matter how rich you are. Don't matter how, what family you were born. Look at the royal family and how one of their kids went off the rails, right? And is writing books about it. Like, it doesn't matter. Everybody has problems. But some people succeed and other people don't. The first thing you have to understand is that where you are is directly correlative to the choices you've made. Most people won't accept that because they don't want to admit that they are where they are because of their own choices. But for those who will accept that and who will admit that, it becomes the most powerful force moving forward. Because if it's true that where I am today is because of the sum of the choices I've made until now, then it must also be true that wherever I want to go from this point forward will also be the sum of all the choices I make from this point forward. So it's a little bit embarrassing looking backwards, but it's absolutely empowering looking forward. So when you can come to the point and say, look, I'm fat because I eat too much and don't exercise. I'm broke because I'd rather buy a Louis Vuitton bag than stick it in a mutual fund. Whatever your thing is, once you accept that, you totally have the power to change your life.
Mhm. That's amazing stuff. And you boil it down so simply. I often, in fact, people around here around the station are sick of hearing it, but I talk about, it's not our problems. We always have problems. We're always going to have problems. It's how we solve them. It's what we do now. It's what we do next that determines what happens from here.
Absolutely. And I talk a lot about optimism. I talk a lot about seeing the good in everything. Some people, bad things happen and it ruins them. Other people have bad things that happen to them, and they make something good come out of it. I always use the gal who started Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. I cannot imagine anything worse in this world than having one of your children die. I just can't even imagine. I'm glad it's never happened to me. I hope I die before all my kids. I can't even imagine. But this woman took the most tragic thing that could happen to a human being, and she said, I'm going to let something good come out of this. And unfortunately, there's no way for us to really know because nobody reports. There's no website where somebody says, well, I was going to drive drunk last night, but I went to a mad meeting and I decided not to. But there's probably been millions of lives that have been saved because this woman decided that she was going to turn a tragic situation into an opportunity to make sure that nobody else or fewer people experience that. I think regularly, people say, how do you become successful, know all these people, have all this rapport? One of my best-selling books is a book called How to Talk to Anybody, Anytime, Anywhere. And I tell them, I think a lot of it has to do with those 11 schools that I went to, because when you show up, you sink or swim. You can either sit in the corner and go, well, I'm not going to get to know anybody and I'm going to probably move again anyway in 8 months or 16 months or whatever. But I learned how to go into a brand new school and make friends. I still have friends. My oldest friend is a friend that I had from the 3rd grade. I went to school with him for a year and a half. and we're still in touch. I have friends from the eighth grade and you know, on and on and on, all the way back. And I think, you know, I learned that you can either be you know, you can be fearful from going into new places, or you can learn a skill set. I wasn't thinking about it at the time. It's just the way that it worked out, and it served me my entire life. I can talk to anybody.
All right, Chris. So we've talked about us a little bit and personal accountability, the only kind of accountability. For those of us that lead others, whether it's family or employees on the job, or even members of a community or organization, if we're only personally accountable, how do we help others be personally accountable?
I think you help them find their motive. And I'll give you an example. I was working with a group of, they were in an association, but it was an industry association, and these guys all came together. The companies came together twice a year. You know, 20 or 30 companies, the sales managers would come together, and they sort of benchmarked each other and brainstormed, and they had meetings together to help each other. And I did a few segments for them over the course of 18 months. And I remember one time this guy raised his hand. He said, I have a question. He said, I have a guy on my team who's got great skill set and all these kind of things, but he has not hit his numbers even once. And I can't remember if it was 3 or 5 years, but it was 3 or 5 years. Not once has he hit his quarterly numbers. He said, I've offered him $10,000 bonus if he did his numbers. Never done it. So I said, well, I don't think the guy's money motivated. And he goes, who's not money motivated? And I said, a lot of people aren't money motivated. But I said, let me ask you a question. What does he talk about during breaks or when you go out to the bar with him? Instantly, the guy says travel. He subscribes to every travel magazine, you know, Condé Nast, Travel and Leisure. He's always talking about, oh, I'd love to travel. I want to go on trips, blah, blah, blah. I said, all right, let's do a test. I want you to invite this guy and his wife out to dinner. And he goes, why his wife? I said, because she's going to hold him accountable. She's going to be all over that guy like white on rice. And so I said,
So it isn't all about personal accountability, Chris.
Well, yeah, sometimes you have a spouse who will also
are exceptions slightly.
But ultimately, unless you want to sleep on the couch, you're going to do.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So anyway, sit across the table with him and say, you know what, Joe, you've got great skills. I really believe in you, but I know you've been struggling here. I'd like to help you find some motivation. I want to really reward you. So I'll make you a deal. If you hit your numbers next quarter, I will give you a $10,000 fund to go on any trip in the world you want to.
Wow.
And up to $10,000. Because that's what he had offered him before. $10,000 didn't work.
And it didn't move the needle.
Well, darn it. Guess who made his numbers?
For the first time ever.
For the first time ever. He made his numbers. Now, I don't know why he didn't translate the $10,000 into a trip that he could take. But most people, if they think the $10,000, they think, oh, I got to pay off my Visa bill and I'll do this and I need a new refrigerator and blah, blah, blah. But if you convert it for him and say, I'm going to give you a $10,000 trip, and you do that in front of his wife, who also wants to go on that $10,000 trip, he hit his numbers. Well, what he found was the guy's motivation. He found the compelling reason to act. He always wanted to travel. Now his company is going to pay him to travel if he just hit his numbers. So what happened was he stayed out late, and his wife didn't mind that he stayed out late, because by golly, they wanted to go on that cruise or that trip to Egypt to see the pyramids, or, you know, Machu Picchu or wherever it was they ended up going. But the very next time we met, he said, my dude hit his numbers. He said, first time ever, hit his numbers.
What a great idea. And oftentimes something so simple. And it's hard for all of us in the, you know, it's the forest for the trees analogy or whatever. Yeah. You're in the heat of it, and it's so hard sometimes to step back and go, okay, here's the simple solution right here.
Yep. Yeah. But help them spend some time with folks. You know, spend some time with them, take them out to lunch, ask them what their dreams are, ask them what their hopes are, listen. You know, this sort of fits a little bit, but I became friends with a guy named Bob Paquin. Bob had been the COO of Harry and David and Land's End. And when I met him, he had just become the COO of Blue Nile. And Blue Nile was the first big online jewelry store. And it was based in Seattle. A young guy, about 27, Harvard Business School grad, started it. And they brought in Bob because he was older, to kind of be the old wise guy. Well, I heard Bob tell a story once that when people weren't good at their jobs, he would fire them. But he said, I always fired him about 4 o'clock. And I told him, go clean out your desk and all these kinds of things. And then I'm going to take you to dinner.
Wow.
And he would take them out to dinner. He would fire them. Then he would take them out to dinner and he would be their coach on how to find their new job. And he would say, I will, if you will, if you'll work on these things, commit, I will give you a good referral. You can put me on your resume. You're not a good fit here, da, da, da. And he said, Chris, most of these people knew that I should have fired them. They just didn't have the guts to quit because they had a mortgage payment. But
Sure.
when I offered to help them, he said, I cannot tell you how many people have called me up 3 years after I fired them and thanked me for firing them, not only for firing them, but for helping them find what their real passion was, or their real skill set was, or their real motivation. And I always thought that was so amazing that he would do that. He said, I fire him late in the day, and then I take him to dinner and I help him.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
We all wish we had bosses like that. And personally, I will tell you that I've been fired. I've been in radio all my life practically, so I get it. And it's devastating at that moment in time. But looking back, every single time, it's been the best thing that ever happened for me.
Yeah, because the reason you got fired is because something was going wrong, and you knew it, and they knew it, but they need somebody to do the 3 to 6 show, and you need the payment to make your mortgage. So everybody kind of tolerates it until somebody has the guts to either quit or fire somebody.
Yep, that's absolutely right. In some cases, you got it. Chris, how can we find you online if we're looking to make connections? I know you travel all over the world, but you only coach 10 people at a time. Is that right?
I never coach more than 10, and I'll tell you why. In the mid 90s, when I was building my speaking career, I hired a speaker coach, teach me the business. And I'd already started my business. I was mainly doing youth speeches at the time. And I always remember the guy had like 100 clients. And I remember when he would answer the phone, he'd go, oh, yeah, I got Chris. And I could tell he was trying to find my 3-ring binder on the thing. And I always said, if I ever have a coaching program, I am not going to have so many people I can't remember who they are. And I don't do cookie cutter. You don't get a 3-ring binder. It is personally designed for you and your situation, because I work with a lot of people in different situations, but I never coach more than 10 people. And most of the time it's really never more than about 5, because it's a part of my business. It's not my whole business, but yeah, they can, if anybody's interested in business coaching, life coaching, it usually ends up being a little bit of both, because most people, they might not know it on the surface, but when you dig in, they realize that business and life are, if you have a fight with your spouse every morning before you go to work, you are going to be less efficient at work and less efficient at work. So we help clean up both. But they can reach me at chris@chriswidener.com, chriswidener.com. It's easy to get me there. If they're putting on events or involved in events, that's what I do for a living. I give speeches at events. And so I'd love to connect with anybody. If I can coach them or I can speak at an event, I'd love to do it. It'd be great.
Any book or anything coming out? I didn't get that far into the research.
I actually just released 2 books in the last 4 months. One is an ebook, but the previous one, it's called 4 Seasons. It's a full-length fictional novel. It's about a billionaire who finds out he has 1 year to live. And then I just released a little ebook a couple months ago, I guess about a month ago. But my big book out right now is called 4 Seasons. And it's a fictional book. It's sort of a life meaning of life book. This guy, now all the money in the world can't save him, and it's how he spends the last year of his life sort of preparing his family. And it's got some movie studios interested, which is nice. I actually have 2 books right now. My best-selling book of all time, number 2 on the Wall Street Journal, number 7 on the New York Times, is a book called The Angel Inside. And I write business fiction. So all my books are like 20,000 words. You can read them in 90 minutes. It's usually anywhere between 4 and 10 little life lessons, kind of Tuesdays with Maury kind of thing. But this is a book. It takes place in one afternoon in Florence, Italy. It's a young man who meets a little old Italian man who teaches him life lessons from the life of Michelangelo, and particularly the creation of the David, which has turned into food and wine tours that we do to Florence and the surrounding hillside cities of Siena and Volterra and Montalcino and San Giammano and all those little Tuscany towns. But yeah, go to Amazon, search my name, or just actually if you go to chriswidener.com and hit the store button, it'll take you to Amazon, and everything will be right there on one page. But yeah, I'd love to connect with any of your listeners. Any way I can help them, be happy to do so.
All right. Chris Widener, Widener. Thank you so much for your time. It's great meeting you. I'd settle for doing a podcast with you every month. I think I know I'd be better for it.
Yeah, you're great, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to be here. I know I always say this. I appreciate you bringing me on, because most people don't realize it can be kind of terrifying to hire a speaker or bring somebody on a podcast, because you never know how good they're going to be, right? And when you're putting your name and reputation on the line by going, "Hey, here's our next speaker," and they're terrible, then they all go, "How do you hire that guy?" Right? So anyway, I appreciate you introducing me to your audience. It's been fun.
Well, we have a great producer, and a special thanks to Doug for setting us up and recommending you. It's been great meeting you. Pleasure. Hope we can connect down the road, Chris.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That's today's edition of Getting to Work, the podcast of NCI Works. For all things work in North Central Illinois, go to nciworks.org.